Glory and Honor by Richard Monson-Haefel. Max looked over the Mustang carefully, noting the dings and signs of age. It would need work, but he couldn't spot anything unusual about the aging ship. Though he hadn't worked much on this kind of bird, he was excited to get to know her. Max was 30 years young and feeling his oats, more than ready to get rich quick in the glacium ring races. He was sitting pretty after leaving the service too. Honorable discharge, thank you very much, and would have something to do with his pay after 5 years and practically no time planetside. He just needed a ship. The Mustang Gamma was sitting in a shipyard on Delamar in the Nix system, where Max had landed himself after entering the races. Neither Nix nor the planet itself was known for their luxuries, sitting right in the middle of a worse-for-wear part of the galaxy. This was not the place for your average citizen, but Max had visited with his family when they'd all lived on the Eureka, so he knew the good and bad spots and how to get around them. He wasn't really worried about the ghettos of Nix. He'd take them over ghosting the Vandul any day. He'd come to see the ship that morning, and had bonded with the owner, a retired veteran who'd quickly lowered the price by $50,000 after they'd shared their service tales. But Max only had $525,000 to speak of, so he quickly started pointing out the ship's scars, enough to get the old-timer down to $375,000. That left him with a little more than $150,000 to his name. Still more than enough to shine up his new ship. Max couldn't help thinking about all the ways he could improve the Mustang ahead of the races. From replacing the engines to bodywork and even a new paint job. He'd have to do everything on his lonesome, on a budget as thin as hair, and a time scale of only 6 brutal months to boot. At least it's a Gamma, he said to himself, chuckling. Everyone knows the Beta comes in second in everything. Max decided to find a ship on Delamar to avoid the cost of hulling a racer to Nix. Racers don't have a jump drive. If you owned a ship without a jump drive, you either stayed in the system where you bought it, or you loaded it onto a huller that could jump it for you. That was expensive, and given the history of Delamar and the Glacium races, he was sure he could avoid shipping costs by finding something in-system. The Mustang Gamma was designed for speed and mods, which meant it would take 2 souped-up engines, a lighter frame, and a whole load of other additions just fine. He noticed that a thruster was missing, as well as a pilot seat. Hopefully he could scrounge most of what he needed here on Delamar, but what he couldn't find, he could have shipped, and that would take time. Besides, Max said, to no one in particular, everyone knows that one good thing about galactic mail is it's hundreds of years old, but ain't never been hindered by progress. He laughed to himself and descended back to the old-timer's garage, which he was going to rent from the old vet, who had no immediate need for it. As he descended the stairs, it dawned on Max that his ship should be the Nosferatu. Between some wicked modifications and smart paint, he could easily make it look graves cool, as he liked to say. It's not enough to win the race, he thought. You gotta do it looking wicked. He started inspecting the ship, seeing more and more work the more he got to know the Nosferatu. He still had to go pay for the Mustang and officially rent the garage, but Max was already thinking of the competition. Ships that cost twice or thrice as much and had 1/10 as many miles. They were designed to be faster than anything, and all that Max had was a rust bucket. But he was a demon in the garage, and he knew that he'd have it up and purring like a puma kitten in no time. Soon enough, Max thought Nos will be faster than anything what's ever raced the Glacium. With his service time and his experience as a grease monkey, he only hoped he had the skill to manage it. The old vet and former racer's name was, oddly enough, Ship, a nickname he had gotten in the service. The old salt had quickly become an asset for Max, as he had everything a Glac racer would need, from the space for modding the Mustang to a full set of tools and years of racing wisdom. He also told Max where he could get the best prices locally on the parts he needed. They became fast friends, too. Other than the ship, Max spent the next 6 months in something like solitary confinement. But with the Nosferatu for company, there was little else that he needed. To help out, he bought and modified a surface exploration drone for everything from holding a wrench to lifting the entire ship. The drone was an unusual model, one that he hadn't seen before. It looked remarkably like a giant gorilla, standing 8 feet tall when upright and sporting 6 limbs, 2 sets of arms, and a pair of short legs. He had to spend a couple of days fixing it and getting it running. It ended up functioning pretty well, all things considered. He found that, like old Ship said, all machines got a personality in them. You show them respect, they'll do right by you and the work you give them. Max even began affectionately calling it Lurch, because it tended to do just that when moving about. which was partly his own fault, as he'd only fixed its lifting and not ambulatory capacities. Luckily, Lurch wouldn't need to scale any mountains or walk across desolate planets like it was designed to do. Soon enough, the first set of trial races was upon them. In 6 months of almost non-stop work, Max had managed to turn a rusted wreck into a shining star. He souped up the engines and lightened the frame as planned, but he'd had to do a fair amount more bodywork on the Gamma than he'd intended. Max had painted the exterior with traditional Graves designs, giving it an overall fierce effect. No one would be poking fun at Max's ship anytime soon. Max hadn't been able to sleep in the days before the race, no matter how many folk remedies ship had given him. So when Max found himself sitting in the Nosferatu, at the starting line of the first of many races to come in the Glacium Ring, it felt more like a dream than reality. The only thing that shook him out of it was the other ships, seeing them shining in Delamar's reflected light. Max couldn't help but feel the awe at the beauty of these fine ships, the wonder of human innovation. He was so in awe that he would have missed the start of the race, if not for the bright flash of the starting cannon. Putting one hand on the Nos's dash and the other on the steering, Max whooped, thrilled to be alive and ready to race. The week of the trial races went by in a hurry. The racing left Max's thoughts a rush of calculations, from predicting potential paths, from maneuvering through the Glacium's dangerous distractions. Each day, his alarm seemed to go off at the very moment that he started to feel calm. At first, he tried to chill out on Delamar in the evenings, but he found it to be a dark and desperate place, filled with crowded bars that stank of sweat. Max noticed some racers who let the brutal schedule of the trials get to them. They generally didn't last long. Thankfully, he had lost enough sleep in the service that it barely fazed him. Still, it did seem like the races would never stop. And then Max started winning. He was fueling up at the end of the day, and was dimly aware that the race results were being announced on the holo-view. Out of nowhere, Max heard his name, and he ran to see for himself. Sure enough, there was his own name and the Nosferatu with a winning time for the last of the day's races. He remembered that it had been close, between his ship and another close behind, but he thought for sure that the other guy had won. It can be hard to tell in the confusion of the asteroid belt, especially one as dense and chaotic as the Glacium.
Flaming furnaces,
he mumbled before breaking into a smile. He and a few friendly racers spent the evening celebrating, and for the first time since that first day, Max felt awed that he had managed to get the Nos up and running and that he had won a race. Over drinks and after a full night's sleep, though, the awe quickly turned into something else. The next morning, Max could tell that he was racing differently. He took turns a bit too tightly. He pushed the Nosferatu harder, and he started winning race after race. The more he won, the more he wanted to win, and the more Max believed he could win the entire Glacium Ring stock ship race. But for a Graves to win was almost unheard of, much less one who wasn't afraid to paint Graves Nation tribal designs and colors on his ship. So Max soon found himself being confronted by reporters when he was between races. At first, he thought they just recognized what he had, that he was a winner. But the questions revealed their true motives. While the first few reporters merely asked him about the Nos and the many modifications he'd done, the longer they talked, the more they betrayed their own prejudices. One or two questioned whether his ship's bright colors would be a disadvantage by making him stick out amid the competition. Others wanted to know how someone with so little experience had learned how to retrofit a Mustang like he had, or how he'd come to know how to race in the first place. They acted like he was a child, asking him more about the other people who must have helped him get out there than about his own experiences. "I did this myself," Max said finally, exasperated. "I didn't get much in the way of help, aside from a friend or two. Don't you think a Graves Nation member can become a racer of his own volition?" But they just stared back at him as though he'd told them the verse was flat. "Sure," one reporter finally said, breaking the awkward silence. "But you must have had help, right? How else could you get so far?" That was his breaking point. Max told the reporters that he had another engagement. He didn't, and then retreated from the reporters to a bar down on Delamar. There was little peace to be found there. Instead of inane questions, he was subjugated to toast after toast from fellow Graves Nation members, alongside his newfound fans. Most were just excited to see one of their own winning as a clear representative of their own culture. What with the colorful designs and the demon face on the Nos's prow. Some were former Graves members who'd given up the ghost for one reason or another. A few were reporters or commentators looking to get an exclusive on the upstart of the year's races. Max had little time for the latter. and he was just leaving the bar when he ran into a fellow racer, a woman wearing a ragtag mechanic's jumpsuit. She quickly smiled at him, reached out a hand to shake. He took it, and she leaned in to talk.
I'm Cal. I hear you're Max, today's star racer. Want a drink?
Sure, he replied, taking the stool beside her. You're Cal? Didn't you get close to the finals last year? Max remembered the coverage on a pay-per-view race channel, so it was fairly likely that she'd gotten quite far, as the media usually only covered the best racers.
Yeah, I got into the second elimination, but I ran my ship into an asteroid like a noob. You're Graves Nation. I saw the designs on your ship. Nice mods.
Cal said, holding his eye contact as if she were just another one of the mostly male racers.
Where did you get your ship? It's originally a Mustang Beta, right?
Gamma, Max replied, smiling. He wasn't sure if she was messing with him or if she was actually inexperienced. Only a true noob would mistake a Mustang Gamma for a Beta, but the alcohol in Max's mind smoothed the edges of their conversation. Took me 6 months to get that bucket of bolts into shape, he added, beaming with pride.
Well,
Cal said, leaning close to him as she lowered her voice.
you seem like a fine mechanic and racer, so I'm going to give you some advice.
Cal's expression turned serious as she continued.
Don't trust anyone. We're all here to win, and we'll do whatever needs doing.
She leaned back and chugged her brew before turning back to Max and adding,
Let's grab dinner after the first elimination, eh, friend?
At that, she jumped off her stool and stalked out of the bar, men and women moving out of the strange racer's way as she did so. Sure enough, we will, Max said to no one in particular, confused but also charmed by his new acquaintance. And may the best racer win. With a series of wins behind him, taking a pole position seemed easy, but the first week of actual stock ship races was not. With 32 competitors, the first of 3 elimination races was well known for whittling down the competition. It had lived up to its reputation too. Max had witnessed no fewer than 4 crashes into asteroids. It certainly made things interesting, but he didn't seem to understand how or why so many competitors were failing so spectacularly. With the speed and maneuverability of the Nos, Max was able to clear the field in almost record time, albeit with 3 fellow racers on his tail. As he relaxed in the official racer's bar, which still smelled of sweat and desperation, Max noted that among the runners-up was Calamity, piloting the Victoria. This was the woman pilot he had met before. Cal was short for Calamity. He didn't have time to think too much about it though, as he was doing his second interview of the day. When the journo arrived, a short, stout man with former Graves ancestors, he was full of questions about Max's growing popularity. By this time, he had already fielded all kinds of questions from reporters about his membership in the Graves Nation. His first interview had been almost entirely about growing up as such, what his family life had been like, what had inspired him to fly, and such like things. Mostly, it was big news that he was flying with his colors proudly displayed. What he hadn't realized was just how far word had spread, with many Graves members who were not Glacium fans starting to follow the races. It made Max proud to be a representative of his people, and even prouder that his ship was inspiring commentators, fans, and others to appreciate his community and their heritage. Max told the stout reporter as much before he left. Before he was able to leave and fix up some dents from a close brush with an asteroid earlier, Max ran into Cal, who was chatting with a man he didn't recognize. Her seeming friend turned when Max said her name, and then introduced the stranger.
Hey, friend. Meet the man behind the races. This is Fengal Sten, owner and operator of the Glacium.
Cal said, gesturing to the tall, slim man with a hint of a mustache.
Hello there. Max, is it? Please call me Fen.
The man said, his smile seemingly locked in place.
So, are you tired of questions about the Graves Nation yet?
No, not yet, I suppose, Max replied, smiling, a bit nervous to meet the man behind the Glacium. At the very least, Max had found that he could be charming of late, but especially when discussing his clan. I think prejudice can blind people, in the case of this race, often fatally. Nobody expected a Graves man to win. Heck, nobody takes the Graves Nation seriously, but I'll gladly use that to my advantage.
I think it's a shame,
Cal added, smiling back.
but I think there's a bit of pride involved. People think they'll win because they always win. That's not how life or the Glacium works.
Well, sure enough, that's true, Max replied, taking a swig of the drink that he'd carried over.
But I will win, Maximilian Strange.
Cal stated, her voice taking on a serious tone again.
Come on, Cal. I'm sure the best racer will win. Whether that's you or...
Finn tried lamely, still smiling his trickster smile, but Max interrupted him. "I beg to differ," he said, staring into Cal's cool gray eyes. They held the stare a moment more before Cal looked away and smiled again, chugging the last of her drink.
You're probably right.
She said, standing up.
You are the better pilot.
With that, Cal walked away from Max and Finn, who both stared after her uncertain.
Can I buy you dinner?
Finn asked.
I would hate to leave a fine racer like yourself eating alone the day before the third elimination.
Sure, Max replied, lingering on his doubts for only a moment before turning to his new acquaintance with a smile. "I'd be much obliged." Max barely remembered the day of the third elimination races. He knew what he'd eaten for breakfast, some kind of slurry that Ship had cooked up and stowed on the Nos, and he knew that he'd spent the hour beforehand checking all the riskier mods on the Nosferatu, but he could barely recall the race itself. He had had another moment of intense awe staring at the 16 ships assembled around him, a group of Mustangs, Auroras, Avengers, Heralds, and other small ships gleaming in the void of space. Each pilot had enhanced their ship for speed and maneuverability to the utmost, packing in as much power as possible. The roar of the fans in the hollow-view had broken Max from his reverie. He'd had the pre-broadcast on to get a better sense of the competition, but he'd been distracted by his nerves. Now, however, the commentators were discussing him. They chatted weekly about the Nosferatu and the Graves Nation, but it was when they switched to the footage of the viewers all over the galaxy that Max felt his muscles tense. People knew his name. Some were even chanting it. It was all he could do to turn the hollow-view off and focus on the race. The next thing he could remember clearly was stepping off the Nosferatu and being greeted by a crowd of journos, all hoping to get his next interview. He'd spoken with a few before meeting up with Finn again, who was holding a private party for the racing elite. That's why he'd paid for Max's meal. He was the year's upstart, and thus obviously invited. After getting away from the crowds, Finn bought Max lunch again, and they chatted about the race. Finn was excited to see so many new faces at the races, and such large crowds on the hollow-view. With so much praise for him and the Nosferatu, Max was excited to discover that he was not just a good racer. He was great.
You're giving people something to come together around.
Finn noted between mouthfuls of food.
To appreciate Graves culture. I'm not sure anyone has ever shown just how silly all those stereotypes are, but you're an accomplished veteran, mechanic, and racer. That's truly admirable.
Sometimes I can't believe it neither, Max replied, eating his food greedily. But I worked hard to get here, and I deserve to win.
Well, you've got the ship and the skill to, and I certainly hope you do, but be careful.
Finn said, his mouth full.
Skill and a fast ship are helpful, but racing is more than just that.
His words echoed in Max's mind over the rest of the week as he did several more interviews and chatted with commentators about what it was like to race so openly as a Graves tribe member. But they faded into the background the more the journalists, fans, and even other racers told him how great he was. Max felt like a star, and he often felt like he deserved it. That is, until he attended Finn's party. He arrived fashionably late, wearing new and almost fashionable clothing. Heads had turned when he walked in, but Finn had quickly come over and began taking him around the room, introducing him to all the best racers. Max was honored to meet with them, but mostly held his own, telling stories with charm and poise. Most smiled wryly when they met him, or they sized him up quickly, as if he wouldn't notice. And they all looked at him like lions looking at a stray house cat, amused, if a bit annoyed. At a calm point, Max pointed out as much to Finn, but the merchant glossed it over.
You're being oversensitive, Max. Everyone is glad to see you doing well, but especially as a member of the Graves Nation.
Finn said, handing him a glass of some unidentifiable fancy drink.
Enjoy yourself. This time tomorrow, you'll be the winner of the Glacium races.
From then on, the night passed quickly, and Max was almost sad to see the night end, especially when no appearance by Calamity, who was one of the final competitors. When he got back to the Nosferatu, it was already late, but Max couldn't quiet his mind. So he turned on the hollow-view and watched footage of him and his ship, with him answering question after question, as if he'd been a representative of the Graves Nation his entire life. From the reports, he and the Nosferatu were the favorite for the final race. Everyone was betting on him. "I'm really gonna win this thing," Max said, smiling to himself. He'd lost. Max had sat in his ruined ship for a few minutes before it really dawned on him. The salvage crew had showed up a few minutes later and given him a ride back to Delamar, but they'd been no comfort. One of the two had been a Graves man, who merely glared at Max while the other had cracked jokes about how much he'd bet on the Victoria. By the time Max fully understood what was happening, his ship had been junked, and he was watching the various reports of the Victoria's calamity. There had been an asteroid, he recalled. Max had been racing neck and neck with the Victoria. It was a fine ship, and he had been proud to see that the Nosferatu had been able to hold its own. But the asteroid had come, seemingly from nowhere, and he'd been positioned such that he had to choose between running straight into Cal's ship or crashing his own. But was that all there was to it? Or had he been careless with his ship? Max wasn't sure. Watching Cal answer various inane questions in the Holoview, he remembered what she had said about pride, how it blinds you. He had thought her a friend, and himself a prize-winning racer. He'd taken both for granted without recognizing that neither were true, or rather, neither had been true. The news reports about him were making much the same point, that Max had been prideful for a rookie, that he disappointed an entire nation because of his recklessness. Max walked out of the shipyard and headed toward the old ship's garage. All that he wanted at this point was to start again. He was out of money. He couldn't even afford to pay the rent on the hangar anymore. As he walked past Ship's place, he didn't stop to commiserate. He felt too ashamed to even talk to his friend. Instead, he walked into the empty hangar and looked around. He didn't have much to his name, and the space there where Nos had once stood was like a vacuum in his chest. It hurt like hell to lose like this, but glancing around, he spied Lurch in the corner. It dawned on Max that the modified old exploration droid represented a way out. He didn't need the hangar without the Nosferatu, and he could use Lurch's lifting power to find a paying gig on a freighter. From there, he could find more jobs. He could make a life far from the races and the people who might recognize him, something far away from his failure. So he and Lurch caught a ride to the Terra system for a menial job loading heavy freight into haulers. In the weeks that followed, he didn't watch the news or check any of his hundreds of messages. Max didn't want to deal with all the frustration that he knew too well. To see his people represented by a fool, or by a stereotype that was all too familiar. Luckily, no one recognized Max, at least not at first. Then one day in the market, while looking for parts to upgrade Lurch's ambulatory system, he felt a hand on his shoulder. A fellow gravesman faced him. Max winced, prepared to be berated for his youthful foolishness, for his carelessness. But instead, the man pulled Max in for a brief hug, and then faced him. A quick grave salute. "Thank you, young man," the man stated, explaining how proud he was to have such a noble person represent the Graves Nation. "You've done us all a great service, showing the verse the nobility and the virtue of the Graves people."
We're not just known for banging like bunnies.
A woman on the other side of Max added. He turned to see her saluting him as well, a wry smile on her face as she walked past. "I don't understand. I crashed my ship," Max said, looking confusedly at the man and at several other people in the market who were coming toward him, smiling. "To save another racer's life," the man replied.
You sacrificed yourself. You could have died.
A young boy added from somewhere in the crowd.
You're a hero, Maximilian Strange.
A woman's voice noted, further off. Then the whole crowd began chanting his name.
Max! 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 Max!
It was all that Max could do not to cry, and then he didn't care anymore. He allowed himself to let go of all his shame for losing, and for giving his people a bad name. In the end, he'd actually done them proud. Hours later, after much celebration and several gifts and friendly hugs from his fellow Graves Nation members, Max checked his many messages. There, he found hundreds of messages of support and praise. People stated again and again how much they appreciated that he had not only shown that a Gravesman could be a great racer, but that his people had dignity enough to recognize when winning was not enough. Life had more to it than that. There were many requests for interviews as well, along with a few from friends, including Ship. Finn, too, had left several messages of support and pointed out that there were multiple backers hoping to bring him back next year. But Max was done with the races, done with the limelight and the pride of them. He enjoyed his brief time there, as he told Finn in his brief reply. But he wouldn't go back to the Glacium Ring, though he was humble enough now to know that life had a way of taking you where it wanted. Either way, Maximilian Strange wanted more from life than the greed and speed of the races. More than anything, he supposed that he just wanted to savor the galaxy, humanity, life, and his little part of it. This is Captain Bane. Thank you for taking the time to listen to SCLoreCast's telling of Glory and Honor by Richard Monson-Haefel. This Star Citizen fanfiction in its original form can be found within the short stories section at max-strange.com. A direct link to this short story is included in the associated description of this Lorecast. A special thank you to Richard for authorizing the use of this content. I look forward to sharing his work with not only the fans of Star Citizen, but anyone who enjoys solid storytelling and rich character development. Please take a few minutes to visit his website to enjoy his other short stories, superb illustrations, and other supplementary information. Finally, if you enjoy these Lorecasts, please take a moment to share a link to this episode through whatever mechanism is appropriate for the platform. I truly appreciate your feedback, and look forward to working with talented writers to continue bringing the lore of the verse to life. Thank you all, and for all you Star Citizen fans out there, we'll see you in the verse.